Welcome and good greetings to all of you who are joining us in virtual space. My name is Gabrielle Tayac, and I am an associate professor of public history at George Mason University. I also have had the honor to spend the course of my personal and professional experience working to find and raise up hidden histories in Native America for a wide audience, with many years serving as a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian. This calling makes me especially thankful to spend this time with a panel of esteemed scholars. Tatiana Sejas, Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, James Brooks, Carl and Sally Gable, Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Georgia, and Ramon Gutierrez, Preston and Sterling Morton Distinguished Service Professor of U.S. History and the College, University of Chicago, all of whom are illuminating the lives and legacies of too often nameless, too often forgotten ancestors who experienced intergenerational enslavement. Our panel, Slavery in the Spanish Empire, the Philippines, and the Southwest Borderlands, explores how systems of Indian bondage, bringing people and goods between the Asia-Pacific, North American, and European continents were interconnected. Our esteemed panelists also will help us understand the motivations for and systems of Native bondage in the Southwest Borderlands. First, I would like to introduce Tatiana Sejas, who is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University. She writes about the history of freedom and slavery, long-distance trade, global connections, and urban economies. She is currently working on two manuscripts, Global Mexico City in the 17th Century, and that's a new economic history of one of the early modern world's greatest entrepôts centered on the lives of ordinary people, and First Roots, Indigenous trade and travel in North America. That work recovers the history of Native merchants who forged routes of exchange between the Rio Grande Valley and the Mesoamerican highlands. And so now Tatiana will share her presentation, Slavery and Freedom in Mexico City, Stories from the 17th Century. Tatiana?
Thank you, everyone, for spending your time with us. It's an honor to participate in this very important symposium. Our panel is about slavery in the Spanish Empire, specifically the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So I thought I'd start with some political background. This territory included what is today the U.S. Southwest, parts of the U.S. South, Mexico, parts of the Caribbean, and the Philippines. The Viceroy, based in the Viceroyalty's capital, Mexico City, claimed to govern all of these vast territories for the Spanish king. The reality on the ground was much different. Indigenous nations, as we know, wielded sovereignty over much of this expanse. It's nonetheless useful, I think, to consider imperial government to understand the legal structures that sustained chattel slavery and other forms of forced labor. In our case, the focus on Mexico City allows us to highlight that the application and enforcement of the laws in the capital were different than their execution in the borderlands of the empire, a reality that my fellow panelists will discuss in more detail. Today, I'll share several stories to show you how people use their legal knowledge to claim their freedom and otherwise protect themselves from the brutality of forced servitude in this capital city. I show you Mexico City. The city's economy, like that of other 17th century cities, such as Manhattan under Dutch rule, depended on slave labor. In the foreground, you see people of African descent laboring in the fields, leading mule trains, and generally doing hard work. Not shown are the enslaved people of Asian and Indigenous descent who labored by their side. Now, prior to 1679, it was legal in this city for slave owners to buy and sell enslaved people from all over the world, and they did. The laws of chattel slavery applied to people born in present-day Angola, the Philippines, the United States, etc. People from all of these regions could be legally held as property. Then the laws changed so that only people with African ancestry were legally enslavable, and similar laws passed in Virginia at around the same time. It was a period when slavery was racialized across the Americas. This history, I think, is better known in some ways than the contemporary struggle by Indigenous people who sought the legal protections the Crown had promised them a century prior and again after 1679, which was that Native Americans who accepted Spanish rule and paid taxes could not be enslaved. Now, I think it's quite difficult to grasp this legal reality and what it meant to people who experienced slavery. So I'm going to tell you about several men, all men, who navigated these laws to live freely. Their experiences reveal the legal complexity of living at a time and place where your geographic origin and ethnic ancestry determine the laws that apply to you as opposed to your neighbors. Wherever there was slavery, there was freedom seeking. These were opposite realities. An enslaved person was the legal property of a slave owner. A free person belonged to herself. Jacinto and Diego worked as coachmen, like the person depicted in this painting. You can see the detail. These two men found a way to free themselves. To do so, they nightly held card games for other African-descended people in their room to earn money to self-purchase. This legal possibility that enslaved people could buy their freedom to pay slave owners to manumit them was true everywhere in the Spanish Empire. Realistically, however, this route to freedom was only available to people like Jacinto and Diego, who lived in a city that afforded opportunities to accrue capital, and with a court system that protected the rights of formerly enslaved people. You can imagine that enslaved people elsewhere, such as in a small mission town in Texas, hundreds of miles from the center of political power, they did not have such possibilities. Jacinto and Diego were either born in Africa or descended from people who survived the Middle Passage. Their presence in Mexico City was part of the transatlantic slave trade. Other enslaved people arrived in Mexico City via the Trans-Pacific slave trade. They were forced to embark on an annual ship sponsored by the Spanish Crown called the Manila Galleon that linked the Philippines to Mexico. This map depicts a Manila Galleon ship. You can kind of see it in the middle. It helps us visualize the long trajectory. It took upwards of 6 months to make the crossing. The ships left Manila Bay carrying objects like Chinese porcelain and cotton cloth from India, as well as enslaved people. The ship's passengers, some 400 in all, faced overcrowding, general misery, and the enslaved people on board, of course, suffered beyond all others. The slave market in Manila had an extraordinarily diverse population. You can see Manila in the red triangle. Here, slave traders sold people from all over Asia, Africa, to local slave owners and for export to the Americas via the Manila Galleon. There were enslaved people who were foreigners to the Philippine Islands from present-day countries like Japan, and enslaved people from the Philippines archipelago, including men and women from the southern islands, which remained under the sovereignty of Muslim sultanates, the area in the blue circle. Spanish law considered that these people were legally enslavable because they rejected Christianity, and more importantly, because they successfully prevented colonists from settling in their lands. The same was true for people who lived in other regions at the edges of the empire, such as present-day Colorado, who refused to accept Spanish rule. Now, Spain claimed sovereignty over the whole of the archipelago, the whole of the Philippines. They called it the Spanish Philippines, but its military presence was nearly insignificant in most of this territory. This print of Saint Xavier was meant to celebrate Spain's imperial glory. But if you look closely, you'll see that Saint Xavier is on Manila, the one port town that they held, while the Muslim islands in the Sulu Sea are out of reach. Spanish soldiers warred against the soldiers of sultans for over 300 years, a long conflict typically described as the Moro Wars. These incursions into Muslim territory were primarily slaving expeditions, raids to acquire quote-unquote war captives. So this history of slave raiding returns us to Mexico City. Salvador was born in Mindanao in the 1620s. When he was about 10 years old, a Spanish captain named Diego Sanchez seized him as a war captive. The soldier had been out with the governor of the Spanish Philippines on a slave raid under the cover of carrying out quote-unquote just war. Once captive, this child was taken to Manila, where he was baptized and given the name Salvador. Right? We don't know his given name. Sometime afterwards, the captain embarked with Salvador and several other enslaved people on the Manila galleon, bound for the port of Acapulco in Mexico, shown in this engraving. The captain amassed a fortune in Mexico City, shown here in this map, as the owner of a hat factory. Salvador grew up working in his household. He was spared from the more punishing work at the factory, but daily survived the indignities of slavery. Some 40 years passed until Salvador had a chance to experience liberty. The captain dictated his last will and testament in 1671, quoted here. The text reads, "It is my will that Salvador from Mindanao, my slave, be manumitted after my days have ended. He's to be liberated from subjugation and servitude in order that he be able to dispose of his property as a free person. I give him 200 pesos plus an adobe house." Salvador had to wait until the captain died to be manumitted, but there is a glimmer of hope in thinking that he ended his days as a free man, with some property of his own, albeit half a world away from his birthplace. Salvador was one of many children taken in slave raids. Their stories testify to the connection between war and slaving as economic activities that sustained slave regimes around the world. Spain's frustrated colonial project in Asia foreshadowed subsequent attempts by foreign states to claim these Pacific islands. This manuscript of the Quran from Mindanao, shown in that map, entered the Smithsonian's collection in 1904, same as this brass helmet, also from Mindanao. It was a time when the US government was waging its own colonial war against the people of Mindanao. The third story connects Mexico City to present-day New Mexico. As many of you know, among the gravest crimes committed by colonists involved the people of Acoma. You can see it in the map here, right? Acoma sits on a bluff. In 1598, 70-plus Spanish soldiers murdered and maimed an untold number of Acoma Indians in a terrifying onslaught that lasted 2 days. The residents who survived the massacre were taken as captives. Children were, quote-unquote, entrusted to colonists as servants, and those over, quote, 18 or 19 years of age were declared slaves for 20 years, end quote. What became of many of these young people is unknown, but we do have the knowledge of one survivor. Approximately 4 years after the events at Acoma, a 13-year-old boy named Pedro de Vergara, described as having a broad face and with a slightly raised chest, came before the viceroy. Here's the document. Pedro had been listed in the property records of a certain captain who had, quote, acquired him in the War of Acoma, at Acoma of New Mexico, end quote. At present, the orphan child was living with another person, Domingo de Luna, who's named in this document, who did not have the necessary legal paperwork to keep Pedro in his household, to force him to be a servant. And the legal title was at issue because, quote, and this is in the words of the viceroy, until this moment, it has not been declared that the said war was justified. Right, so going back to that whole just war idea. And there was a legal battle going on at the time to determine what had happened. You'll remember from Salvador's experience that the captivity is, in a so-called just war, was the main legal justification for slavery in the Spanish Empire. The viceroy, thus, wanted to, quote, look out for the good of the boy and ensure that he be well treated and indoctrinated until he reached legal age. Now, from the viceroy's perspective, this goal was compatible with keeping Pedro in the same household. Domingo was thus entrusted to provide food and shelter and to, quote, teach him good manners, but only until Pedro reached 14 years of age, so 1 more year. And then the viceroy continued, in this fashion, Pedro will acquire some assets. Now, imagine this child's life. After surviving the flames that destroyed his hometown, Pedro was forced to travel over 1,400 miles from New Mexico to Mexico City. What happened next? Did Pedro leave Domingo's household upon reaching his 14th year? Probably yes. The record, however, does not tell us, or if there are other survivors like him in the city. Primarily here is a window into the Spanish Empire's legal apparatus. In Pedro's case, the highest official in the land identified him as a survivor at Acoma, and at the very least protected him from legal slavery. This map is another vision of Pedro's homeland, where he likely never returned. In this territory, far from the center of colonial government, the laws protecting children from enslavement had little bearing on the ground. Now, Mexico had a global population with residents from Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. This intermingling of people from around the world was related to the trans-Pacific, transatlantic, and trans-hemispheric slave trades. You see this diversity on people's faces on this painting. Jacinto, Salvador Sanchez, Pedro de Vergara, all lived in this place. They walked in the streets. We garner their stories from archival documents, seeing glimpses of their experiences. And for me, this storytelling is part of how we acknowledge the legacies of captivity, slavery, and colonialism. The US began with 13 British colonies and extended westward. This map helps us visualize a critical geopolitical reality. In the 19th century, the US politically claimed large parts of what had once been the Viceroyalty of New Spain. First militarily through the Mexican-American War and then the Spanish-American War, which took US soldiers across the Pacific. New Mexico is now a state, and the Mariana Islands are US Commonwealth, for example. That process, which mainly involved settler colonialism, was tied to slavery and had devastating consequences for indigenous nations. When US soldiers occupied Mexico City in 1847, slavery had already been abolished in Mexico, not so in the US. And this juxtaposition, freedom to the south and slavery to the north, shaped the history of the US-Mexico border region in the lead up to the Civil War. To my mind, the history of the US is inseparable from the history of New Spain and the many forms of forced labor that built our country. Thank you. I'll give it back to you, Gabby.
Thank you, Tatiana, for taking us into an intercontinental journey of lives who would have otherwise been forgotten without your incredibly important and detailed work. Now it's my pleasure to introduce James F. Brooks, who is an interdisciplinary scholar of the Indigenous and colonial past, having held professional appointments at the University of Maryland, UC Santa Barbara, and UC Berkeley, as well as fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, and Vanderbilt University's Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. In 2002, he became the director of SAR Press, and between 2005 and 2013, served as the president of SAR. He recently concluded 10 years service on the board of directors of the Western National Parks Association, which supports research, preservation, and education in 67 national parks, including Coronado National Monument, Chaco Culture National Historic Park, and Channel Islands National Park. He is a trustee of the Santa Barbara Mission Archive and Library. He serves as an advisory scholar to the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, and he maintains a research professor appointment at UCSB to support graduate training and hold the position of senior consulting editor of the Public Historian, the flagship journal of that discipline. There, he hosts graduate student assistant editors from the University of Georgia under the Gable Editorial Training Program. Now James will share his work, Indigenous Enslavers in Colonial North America, Contagions of Violence on the Borderlands. James?
Thank you so much, Dr. Tayac. I'm delighted to be here with these distinguished colleagues and to be participating in a symposium that's very long overdue and very important. And I'm delighted to share the stage with such distinguished people. So I'm particularly pleased that Dr. Sejas' introduction to us really kind of introduced the notion of a global world in the 16th century and into the 17th centuries, because we don't really understand the world in that way necessarily. But the Spanish Empire was a global empire very early on. And that means that whether we're talking about economies or warfare or seafaring or slavery, we really kind of have to do it in a global context. And that's part of what I'm going to try to do here today, is to take the question of indigenous slavery and turn it turn the camera angle in a direction we seldom wish to go, because you can't have enslavements without enslavers. And it's very rare in the global history of slavery that the people that end up owning slaves, being slaveholders, are actually the people who procured those slaves. So what I want to talk about is the unhappy truth that much of the activity of enslavement that took place in Spanish America, and certainly in North America, which is what I will look at, happened under the agency of other indigenous peoples as slave hunters, slave catchers, who then brought their captors into marketplaces where they would go out into the world. It's an unhappy truth, but it's also one that helps to explain a lot of indigenous history in North America. Because once slave raiders and slave capturers and takers get into that business, they have plugged themselves into a vibrant global economy and a great deal of wealth in the terms of, gunpowder, lead, guns, any number of steel implements comes pouring back into indigenous America. And so this is the engine of transformation that we see across the whole continent. So I want to begin, though, by looking first at some questions around pre-contact, pre-1492 forms of slavery, because I'm often asked as a scholar of indigenous slavery, well, isn't that a European imposition? That Indian people never would have been slaveholders, and in some ways that may be true, because the slavery that we're going to be talking about today is very much a matter of a historical process. However, if we look at the archaeological record, we do see signs that suggest at least some forms of capture, human bondage, and social inequality were baked into indigenous societies well before 1492. And I've put up some images here. You see a couple of effigy images that come out of the Mississippian world in the kind of the 11th to 14th centuries of the North American Southeast that have been interpreted as captives subject to restraint. They're bound. These are images associated with kind of the degradation, social degradation that is often associated with the condition of slavery. You see also an image that represents a trophy being taken from a presumed enemy or captive by a Mississippian chieftain. He's severed the head of his opponent and is claiming it as a trophy. So what we do know is that bioarchaeologists now make a convincing argument that a great deal globally, but certainly in North America, we have some of the best evidence for it. There was a really dramatic commerce between cultures, especially in women and children. That these violent captures and assimilations were primarily aimed at bringing other people's women and children into the social body of a given group, what you might call tribe today or nation today. And archaeologists, like the book I feature on the left, Kathy Cameron, in her Stolen People book, she takes a global view of this, and she says it's actually a highly adaptive, positively adaptive kind of a violent move on the part of small to medium-sized groups, that bringing in outsiders adds value to your own group. And that is, you're bringing in people who know languages that you do not know. They may know farming and tilling techniques that you do not know. They're bringing new kind of bio-strength DNA into your group. And if you are capturing children as well, you're capturing people who are very malleable and adaptive, quick to learn languages, quick to reassociate and re-identify themselves with the capturing group. So I recommend Cameron's Stolen Peoples, how Stolen Peoples Changed the World, as one place to look. So if Kathy Cameron's book on how Stolen Peoples Changed the World takes a global view of this question, Christina Snyder's book on Indian slavery in North America is a drawing down of the lens into a closer focus. She is primarily concerned with the southeastern of what is the United States, the larger Mississippian world of kind of 1000 AD to about 1400 AD. And she, again, will look at this phenomenon of these captures, the kind of the debasements, we're not sure whether or not this is really a labor input or more a matter of social prestige. The more dependents and captives that you can display in massive public events in these mound cities, So we don't know exactly what they are, but it's clearly that there is a capacity among indigenous people to engage in the captures and assimilations, even if at a very degraded level, of outsiders. And those are the qualities that will allow indigenous peoples to interact with the expanding Spanish Empire around some kind of mutually understood goals and aims. And indigenous peoples in the Southeast and in the Southwest where I work see some opportunity in the expanding Spanish Empire because they have certain things that look like they could improve life, like steel and guns and gunpowder and shot and things like that. But they also know it's going to cost something. And the cost of that is going to be paid in some ways in human bodies obtained from other peoples. So let's move ahead and look at a couple of cases from the early colonial period that I think are really important for understanding the trajectory of indigenous slavery in the Americas. And one is that as soon as you have European colonies in the Americas pushing new kinds of technologies of violence out into the hinterlands, you get the eruption of dislocations of long-term tribal peoples who are expelled and put into movement in ways that they sometimes have to adopt a predatory lifestyle of their own. And the classic case of this is with people historically called the Westo Indians. And Eric Bone has a wonderful book on this. These are the people who, in the early French colonial world, are called the Eries. They reside just south of what we call Lake Erie today. They're, forest woodland hunters and farmers, but they get hammered with the expansion of Iroquois fur trapping and trading and procuring coming out of French Canada and northern and some of the British in northern New York are feeding arms and weaponry into Iroquois hands in order for them to expand their fur trapping. They drive the Eries completely out of their home territory. The Eries go on this long migration that happens to take them through the backcountry of Virginia at precisely the time the Virginians are wishing for a greater slave force to deal with the expanding tobacco plantations they have. The Virginians arm the Eries with firearms and agree and put them to the task of raiding their own peoples, indigenous peoples, Tuscaroras and others, Catawbas, in the Virginia backcountry and selling them to the Virginia colonies. So you get the Westos, which have become this terribly feared, fearsome, basically slaving society. It works its way down clear into the Carolinas and is not actually is only destroyed by the capacity of the Carolinas to recruit Cherokees from the backcountry to attack the backside of the Westo expansion. The Cherokees do this because they would rather not be captured by the Westos and sold into slavery. So that's one case. Alan Galley's book is a much larger look at this. And then Robbie Etheridge's Chickasaw, the Chickasaw, looks at probably the most significant single indigenous transformation into a almost purely slave raiding society by the 16th century, 16th and 17th century. The peoples that we know today as Chickasaws really were drawn in both by the French and the Spanish into this area. I want to move ahead now to some other cases. A book I did some years ago, Captives and Cousins, tries to look at the way that violence and kinship are interrelated in these systems, because the violence of capture is also combined with the assimilation of kinship, either through fictive adoptions or literally the biological creation of new peoples. And this is a story that that you can look at in the case of the Navajos that I write about, that they begin preying on Paiutes to help support the pastoral sheep economy in the 18th century. And by the time that the Navajos are kind of pacified, shall we say, by being driven from their homeland and taken out to the Bosque Redondo, some of the wealthiest Navajos hold dozens of what they call bayotzin, which is the Navajo term for Paiute, which is synonymous with slave in the Navajo dictionaries. Another example is that of the Comanche Empire, who basically support their expanding horse and cattle raiding economy by capturing young Mexicans, especially boys aged kind of 8 to 12, bringing them into Comanche society as subservient servant kin slaves. There's also a taibo is the term in Comanche meaning slave. They're put to work managing horses and cattle. Horses have to drink 5 gallons of water a day to stay alive. Somebody's got to get them to the watering hole. And sure enough, it's these boys who do so. Finally, this is on the right is the Linking the Histories of Slavery book is one that Bonnie Martin and I did recently. And the way that we fit, even though that it has mostly historical cases, we finish by pointing out that there is much in terms of similarity between what we see historically of Indigenous enslavement and the vulnerability of Indian women in border towns today, especially the fracking towns, the man camps in the Northern Plains, where Sarah Deer, who's a MacArthur-winning Muskogean historian and activist, did a chapter for us in this book saying that the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement is a direct outgrowth, a 21st century expression of these many centuries of slaving upon Indigenous people. And finally, I'd like to end with the recommendation of 3 additional titles that have been really important in the development of this field. You, I think, will have heard already from Taya Miles in the session 1 at NMAI, and that is Taya's first book, The Ties That Bind, is an extraordinary treatment of a Cherokee slave holder, Chulio Shoeboots, and the lifelong relationship he has with an African-American woman named Doll, whom he purchases as a slave in her teens, and they spend their, she way outlives Chulio. But they go through, they're in North Georgia, his home location we know of still, but they go through removal. She bears him children. They're out in Indian territory. And one of the painful ironies of the way that these intersecting systems of slavery work out is that because Cherokees maintain a matrilineal society, lines of descent, none of the children that Doll bears, her Cherokee owner and or lover and or husband, qualify as Cherokee. So they have none of the benefits of tribal membership. They appeal. She even makes a last-minute appeal to the Cherokee Tribal Council for her children to be recognized as Cherokee national citizens. That fails. So that's an example of what I call the tomorrow of slavery, the way slavery can end, but the effects of slavery do not. Erica Coleman's For the Purity of Blood book is an extraordinary work looking at in Virginia itself, where you have very early mixtures of African and Indigenous peoples. And those peoples, as they move into the 19th century, as the color line hardens in Virginia between black and white, slave and free, there are just really probably thousands of Indigenous peoples who the law simply can't absorb, nor can society even recognize. And her book covers that story. Finally, Elena Roberts' new book, just out in the last month or so, is the extraordinary story of the freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes who, ironically, and the 5 tribes align with the Confederacy. The Confederacy loses the Civil War. The 5 tribes are only allowed back into a relationship with the federal government with the agreement that they won. Their black slaves have already been freed, but they also bring them on as citizens of the tribal nations, which allows, oddly enough, for the redistribution of allotted land during the allotment era, during the Dawes era, to go to both indigenous peoples and to freed blacks. And it's probably the only place, as she argues in the book, that the dream of 40 acres and a mule actually saw itself come to realization, because many of these freedmen of the Cherokees and Chickasaws and Creeks and Seminoles ended up as landowners in what would ultimately become Oklahoma. And she suggests that the relative prosperity that you see among the descendants of freedmen in Oklahoma fairly early on as a consequence of this land redistribution, Black freedom on native land. So those are the thoughts I'd like to leave here and make those book recommendations, that this is a complicated story and it deserves a lot of reading and thinking and conversation. So I will wrap with that, and thank you, Dr. Tayac, for bringing me on.
I'd like to give also my deepest thanks to James Brooks for taking us into the very long, deep ancestral reach of history and helping us to understand how slavery and enslavers are part of a long trajectory of time on the American continent. I'd now like to introduce Ramon Gutierrez, who is the Preston and Sterling Morton Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of U.S. History and the College at the University of Chicago. He is author of many works, including the multiple prize-winning When Jesus Came, The Corn Mothers Went Away, Marriage, Sexuality, and Power in New Mexico, 1500 to 1846. He has edited issues of several of the field's most prominent journals in the topics of gender and sexuality, and has several co-authored works, most recently, Relational Formations of Race, Theory, Method, and Practice, and that's published by the University of California Press in 2019 with Natalia Molina and Daniel Ho-Sang, with Kathleen Belew, a forthcoming A Field Guide to White Supremacy, and that's with the University of California Press coming in 2021. And New Mexico's Moses Reyes Lopez Tejerina and the Religious Origins of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, that's currently in press. Ramon Gutierrez is a preeminent scholar in Latino, Borderlands, US Western history, and colonial Latin America. And now, thank you, Ramon Gutierrez, for sharing your work, Slavery and Servitude in the Kingdom of New Mexico, 1598 to 1889.
Thank you, Gabby, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with my colleagues and the extensive audience that I hope this session will draw. You'll notice that I titled my presentation Slavery and Servitude in the Kingdom of New Mexico, 1598 to 1889. For those of you who know the history of the Southwest, New Mexico became a Mexican state in 1821, became a territory in 1848. I put the end date of 1889 simply to give you a sense that debt peonage as a form of labor coercion continued in New Mexico until that date under various ruses. When you think of classic slavery, that institution in the Spanish Empire was usually considered a status of a person that was owned as property, who lacked personhood, who had no personal kinship ties to a community, and therefore suffered the humiliations of a dishonored person because they were usually taken as prisoners of war. We find such slaves in the colonial period all the way into the territorial period of New Mexico, Arizona, and West Texas. Those who suffered this condition were mainly from Africa. They were indigenous nomads and settlers, and there were a large number that were actually Spanish and considered white slaves that the colonizing expeditions brought to the New World. In the roughly 12 million African slaves that were sold in the New World, 22% of them went to Spanish America, concentrated in the plantations of the Caribbean and the silver mining regions of Mexico and Peru. Between 1821, when Mexico City was conquered by Cortez, and 1639, 110,525 African slaves arrived in Mexico. Very few of them ever reached the Spanish borderlands, or essentially the northern frontier of New Spain. Slaves were brought to New Mexico as early as 1528, providing labor to the first expeditions of discovery and conquest. Recall Estevanico, the Angolan slave that accompanied Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca in his expeditions across the Southwest. Don Francisco de Sosa Peñalosa, who participated in the conquest of New Mexico in 1598, had in his household, quote, 3 female Negro slaves, 1 mulatto slave, and other indigenous men and women servants. In 1661, Doña Teresa de Aguilera y Rocha, the wife of Governor Francisco de Mendizábal, had in her service 2 African slaves, 4 Apache slave girls, and an indigenous slave woman from central Mexico. Many persons in the Americas were enslaved for allegedly resisting their conquest and domination by Spanish authorities. The Spanish theory of just war was spelled out in a document known as the requerimiento, or the requirement, which mandated enslavement of any peoples that resisted conquest. And let me read from that document. Quote, "We ask and require you to acknowledge the church as the ruler and superior of the whole world. But if you do not do this and maliciously make delay in it, we shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and we shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can as to vassals who do not obey," end quote. This was written by a Spanish jurist named Juan López Palacio Rubio in 1513, and Fray Bartolomé de las Casas used to mock the requerimiento as talking to the trees because it was often read in Latin at a certain distance from indigenous towns and villages and therefore could not be understood by the natives. So it justified them going to war. Now, the first major acts of enslavement in New Mexico occurred in December of 1598. When the residents of Acoma Pueblo failed to quickly provide the Spaniards with food and drink, fighting immediately broke out. 13 Spanish soldiers were killed, and the now infamous Don Juan de Oñate, the leader of the colonizing party, retaliated by waging merciless war against Acoma's residents. 800 Acoma residents were killed on that day. 80 men and 500 women were taken as prisoners of war. All the men and women over the age of 12 were condemned to 20 years of slavery in Spanish households, and all the children under the age of 12 were distributed as servants in Spanish households. All the men over the age of 25 who resisted Spanish domination had 1 foot cut off, leading to a slow, sure, and very painful death. Indigenous forms of servitude, such as those experienced in Western Europe by medieval serfs, were established by the Spanish in post-conquest Mexico and Peru, and through all its empire for that matter, because of the nature of the financial terms the Crown sanctioned for parties of expedition and colonization. They were simply continuing old traditions that had been present in Spain. Now, most of Spain's exploration and conquest throughout the world was underwritten by personal funds of individuals, investment groups, and communal guilds, and those terms were spelled out in what were called capitulaciones, or charters of incorporation. Those charters of incorporation spelled out exactly what the booty of these conquests would include: gold and silver, lands and tribute and labor. The king automatically got 1/5, or the royal quinto. The adelantado, the person who led the expedition, and the main investor often got another 1/5, and often much more. Other investors according to their funding level. And finally, the caballeros, the mounted horsemen, and the foot soldiers according to their rank and their contributions in horses, livestock, and slaves. Now, investors were rewarded with royal grants of land called mercedes, and the lands were divided into what were called propios, which the individual could develop as they wished. And the propios were usually divided into sitios, or house and garden plots, and comunes, village communes, used by all colonists for livestock pasturing, hunting, fishing, and the collection of timber. Now, soldiers were also given aristocratic titles for going to conquer peoples. They were declared hidalgos, or hijos de algo, which means persons of worth and esteem, entering into the Spanish nobility, sporting titles like don in front of their name, which signified their aristocratic status, such as Don Diego de Guzman. Why? The law prescribed that quote, so that the memory of their names and of their bravery in warfare would not soon be forgotten by the natives of the land and would long be cherished and celebrated, end quote. Thus, a once poor, lowly foot soldier became esteemed for his deeds of territorial conquest, enriched by this process, and now with an aristocratic title could expand his business connections and gain access to superior marriage markets for his children. In time and over the generations, they would vaunt and boast that their social precedence in Spanish society was really rooted in the quality of their pure old Christian blood. Now, the conquistadores also were awarded the most important thing, the labor, as tributary grants known as encomiendas. These were multi-generational pensions granted to the soldiers and the descendants for their participation in territorial conquest, colonization, and the local governance of a colony. These were perpetual rights. The word encomienda comes from the Spanish encomendar, which means to entrust. This entrustment was imagined as a reciprocal relationship between an indigenous village or town and the lord to whom they were entrusted, much like feudal lords and his serfs. Now, the encomienda was a reciprocal arrangement of obligations. The encomendero, the grantee, was required to offer military protection against potential enemies in the form of armed men ready to engage in battle, and to Christianize the indigenous subjects. For this protection and Christianization, Amerindians owned their encomendero tribute in the form of labor, cloth, pottery, food, marketable products, or anything he demanded, such as sexual service. Now, the entitlement of the Spanish, the conquest demanded essentially labor, because anyone who considered themselves an aristocrat didn't feel that they should labor and toil. So New Spain's viceroy, Don Luis Velasco, complained in 1608 that, quote, no one comes to the Indies to plow and to sow, but only to eat and loaf, end quote. And if they were to eat and loaf, they needed slaves and servants doing their work. And so Fray Jerónimo de Zárate Salmerón noted in the early 1620s that the encomenderos of 17th century New Mexico were, quote, enemies of all kind of work. Now, you can see what the demographic impact of what's this work, warfare, disease, famine, and labor extraction led to massive indigenous deaths. I have here a chart that shows you the number of indigenous peoples that were estimated in Mexico in 1518 when Cortez landed in the Yucatan Peninsula. That is, the estimate is that there were 25 million people living in Mexico. If you note, 75 years later, in 1593, there was a reduction of almost 75, down to 1 million, which was a massive depopulation of Mexico. We see this pattern reproduced in the Kingdom of New Mexico excellently. So, for example, in 1598, when the Spaniards arrived, they estimated that the indigenous population was 500,000. Less than 26 years later, the number was down to 20,180. By 1679 to 17,000, and by 1860 to 6,550 individuals. Now, indigenous servitude and slavery in the Kingdom of New Mexico varied enormously by period and by ethnic group. So, for example, from the conquest in 1598 to the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, the sedentary Pueblo Indians of New Mexico and Arizona were primarily the ones enslaved during the conquest and after. They had resisted Spanish conquest and domination, and they were distributed as parts of an encomienda grants to the conquering soldiers who worked them, bred them, pimped them, and sold them. After the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, the first successful Amerindian revolt against Spanish rule in the hemisphere, the encomienda was abolished in 1703, but was replaced with a labor institution known as the repartimiento, which was no longer based on whole villages, but rather on individual counts. And then in 1630, we start to see the first nomadic indigenous peoples, called by the Spaniards Indios Bárbaros, barbarian Indians, become the targets of Spanish enslavement. These were first Apaches, Navajos, Comanches, Utes, and Pawnees. Now, before an enslaved indigenous person could enter a Christian household, they first had to be baptized. And therefore, 3,294 Indian slaves of nomadic origin enter into the New Mexican baptismal records between 1700 and 1849. By 1750, about a third of the kingdom's population were Indian slaves. 40% explicitly were identified as slaves or captives, as esclavos or cautivos, and referred to as genízaros, or defeated prisoners of war captured in just war. Ethnically, 61% of them were identified as Apaches and Navajos, 16% as Utes, and 5% as Comanches. Now, there were several euphemisms that were used in baptismal records for servile status of children under the age of 12. Sometimes they were called indios de padres no conocidos, or indigenous children of unknown parents who had been abandoned and forced out of their Indian villages into Spanish towns, or criados, called servile fondlings. Now, Fray Agustin de Morphy described the life of the genízaros of the Kingdom of New Mexico, and he said, "They are captive Comanches, Apaches, and other groups who were taken as youngsters and raised among us. Since they are offspring of enemy tribes, the natives of this province who bear long grudges never admit them into their pueblos. Thus, genízaros are forced to live among Spaniards without land or other means to subsist. They desire sites for villages but fail to obtain any, either because no one wants to provide them or because most of the land have been occupied. On account of their poverty, which leaves them afoot and without arms, they bewail their neglect and they live like animals," end quote. In another case, the example of Barbara, an Indian slave in 1762, she expected that when her master died, his son, Joseph Gallego, whom she had suckled as an infant with her own breast milk, would free her. Every time Barbara requested her freedom, Gallego would beat her. Barbara's children, who were not allowed to visit their mother, sought the governor's intercession. Gallego explained to Governor Vélez Cachipin that he had taken Barbara into his house, quote, not because of her service, because my deceased father bought her, end quote. His behavior could not be considered cruel because he was simply preserving his father's property. The governor agreed and ruled that Barbara, quote, had no basis, end quote, for demanding her emancipation, even though she was old, sickly, and no longer capable of any productive work. Now, gradually, the number of Genízaros residing in Spanish towns increased so much that they were resettled and segregated into independent villages on the margins of the kingdom along known nomadic Indian raiding routes to blunt Apache and Comanche raiders from entering Spanish towns. And so Belén was created as a Genízaro settlement in 1740, Abiquiu and Ojo Caliente in 1754, San José del Vado and San Miguel del Vado in 1794. This is precisely what the word Genízaro meant etymologically from the Turkish, yeni meaning new, and cherry, troops. Like the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, captured slaves who went into battle as the forward shock troops, Genízaros in New Mexico were relocated to hold defensive positions against the Indios Bárbaros, hoping thus to thwart their entry into Spanish towns. By the 1770s, Genízaro identity emerges as a clear kind of identity. It was a stigmatized identity. They were stigmatized by segregation, by demographic growth that transformed them into an ethnic group that was deemed particularly dangerous. Spaniards rejected them as marital partners. They lived together as if they were a nation, como si fueran una nación, speaking their own form of Spanish, which sometimes the Spaniards could not agree. Now, to this day, Genízaro identity is still very much stigmatized. Mischievous and unruly children in New Mexico are frequently taunted as Genízaro, Genízaro, puro indio de rescate, or Genízaro, Genízaro, pure bartered Indian slave. When New Mexicans today say, no seas Genízaro, they mean don't be a liar or crude. Anthropologist Florence Hawley Ellis in 1955 was told by the residents of Tomé, an old Spanish land grant, that the Genízaros of nearby Belén were deemed, quote, semi-slave, low-class, and without any ability, end quote. Anthropologist Francis Swadesh in 1974 noted that when someone is called a Genízaro in northern New Mexico, it means crude, low-class, and indiado. Again, I began this presentation by indicating that slavery in New Mexico extended to 1889, when the United States finally ended debt peonage. From 1598 to 1889, servitude was often hidden from public view and legal view, and it was enmeshed in the language of kinship, referring to slaves as members of the family or as familia. But if we really want to study, and if we take the time to study the origins of the word familia, in antique times it was the unit of slaves. Family was the authority that a master exercised over his slaves, and gradually that authority was extended to wives and to children, giving them virtually the same authority over everyone that was living within a household. Thank you so much for your attention, and I turn it back to you, Gabby.
Well, thank you so much, Ramon, for bringing us through an understanding of the machinery and motivations and the incredible long stretch of enslavement going all the way up to 1889, just centuries of this experience, which are so unknown to most people. And with that, I'd like to invite our panelists to come together. We have Tatiana Sejas, James Brooks, and Ramon Gutierrez all coming together so that we can launch into a discussion of this incredibly rich, complex, and as what's said in Andres Resendez's revelatory work, The Other Slavery, that these stories really are uncovered the stories of Indian enslavement are so much hidden and submerged. And that's really the question that I would like to start in with each of you, that every single presentation has brought forward a richness and a depth, and I know has taken a great deal of your time in your pursuit of knowledge and truth in these untold stories, and also showing the amount of evidence, records, publications dealing with Indian enslavement that really go through hundreds of years, affect thousands, if not millions of people, really involve the entire world. We touched on just about every continent in the world, on the globe, and yet this understanding and these stories are barely known at all. They're not spoken about in the American educational system. We don't have an understanding of them usually even being pulled into any level of US history writ large. So I would like to talk with each of you a bit more about how this foundational global history has been submerged, what the challenges and opportunities are in telling these erased stories. So Tatiana, I would like to start with you because you really brought forward very pointed biographies that helped us to understand really on this micro, personal level, to the degree that you were able to take threads of people's lives from a long time ago in places that all converged into Mexico City. How is it that you were able to find these stories, and what has been your experience in terms of what your reflections are in why they are so unknown?
Great. Well, thank you for that question. I really feel like I've learned so much this afternoon spending time with you. For me, archival research is the foundation of who we are as historians. I have always been invested in reconstructing the lives of ordinary people, and I think that one of the ways that you best do that is by trying to use whatever material is at hand in a creative way. So you had asked about what the work entails, but also like why we're driven to do it. And for me, I think writing history is always about trying to understand our present, right? We look around and the incredible poverty that surrounds us, the inequality, it has very, very deep roots. And so for me, it's always been a matter of trying to maybe figure out, how people have kind of survived through this in the past, and to try to see how it is that we can develop our own kind of coping mechanisms with what seems to forever be a world, any one society in which there are people on top and there are people on bottom.
Yeah, thank you for that observation, because certainly just kind of understanding what drives you to work through what I know is very, archival work can be tedious, it's long, and yet to have that energy to be able to pull those stories. I do want to just ask a follow-up question with you, Tatiana. How did you select the three voices, the three lives that you focused on with us today?
Well, for me, I think it's very important to understand the global reach of slavery. And for me, we are here in North America, bringing it all back to Mexico City, that was once the capital of this area, however you can conceive of it. I picked these individuals, especially Salvador and Pedro, the second ones, because I wanted to show just how far-reaching, how long people have to travel, are forced to travel away from their homelands, And so I think that by kind of identifying these people, I wanted to kind of explain different things, slave trades, but also explain laws, but also explain kind of the long legacy of how some regions are connected. To me, well, as I've spoken with my students about this, it's not always very clear why it came to be that the United States now has the Mariana Islands and Puerto Rico. And so, once you kind of articulate that historical context of it's been, this kind of taking over from previous empires, then that kind of history comes into play.
Well, thank you, Tatiana. So, that's one way of certainly looking into the humanization of this work. And with that, I would actually like to turn to you, James, because you're looking at the idea of reaching through beyond and prior to colonization, seeing Indigenous societies as having this incredible millennia-long history and set of relationships that extend back in time that are often also ignored. And you brought it through actually to the present. And thinking about the present, there was even an article in the June 15th, 2020 New York Times when there was a shooting during the protest dealing with the statue of Oñate in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so that when you link these past and present, for example, with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, we're really looking at an ongoing impact of historical work in terms of agency. So I was wondering if you could comment more about that, because it's just when you see these very contemporary points that emerge, and then understanding that it has a very long legacy going back even to the beginnings of colonialism, and wondering if you could comment more on those kinds of connections in your work.
Yes, I'd be pleased to. I think that I often found myself thinking of, there's an anthropologist, Carolyn Nordstrom, who's worked primarily in Africa, but has always worked in war zones and conflict zones. She's really a student of violence. But she came up with this notion of that there is always a tomorrow to violence. It never ends, even when the act itself ends. There is a tomorrow and a tomorrow, because it becomes a transgenerational kind of transmission. And I think it's important to realize that, especially in the case of Indigenous slavery, you have a form of violence that has been largely suppressed in terms of memorialization and the conversation around it. And I want to commend History Colorado, which is their statewide history organization. This spring began a series of listening sessions down in the southern Colorado, northern New Mexico borderlands of the San Luis Valley, where they just kind of threw the doors open at Fort Garland they threw them open virtually via Zoom at the historic center there, and invited descendants, long-term multi-generational residents of the San Luis Valley, who are descendants of both Hispano settlers, the pobladores, and many of them descendants of the Ute and Apache enslaved children that were brought into those households from the 1860s through the 1880s. And I had the honor of being able to just sit in and listen in on these conversations, these closed conversations. One of the agreements they made, History Colorado made, is that they would not record them, that these were just opportunities for the community to gather and to talk about it. And it was one of the most remarkably and powerful things I've experienced, because people were talking about, speaking publicly about things that had only been whispered about within the families. And there were a lot of tears and a lot of pain and anger. anger there. And also some of the folks from the Southern Ute tribe came over as well. And that's a very complicated relationship because many of the Navajo enslaved children who come into these San Luis Valley households do so because they've been taken by the Ute guides that served with Kit Carson in the Navajo campaign. And the Ute guides are paid for their service in being allowed to take captive children and sell them to whoever wants them, right? So here we had in the present, 2021, people talking about intercultural violence that happened, 80-some years ago, but also, I'm sorry, much longer than that, but also in the sense that of acknowledging a certain kind of kinship among those people, whether it was voluntary or involuntary, they're all now somehow related. And certainly the genetic work that's been done with these folks in the San Luis Valley shows a high preponderance of indigenous lineage in there. So that's, I guess, in my response, it never goes away. There's no end date to the kind of violence that slavery involves.
Yeah, I'd like to circle back to that in a little bit, but also just to, get a sense of really, again, the why are these stories so unknown? Like, what's the block? Understanding that you showed work after work, publication after publication, looking at these kinds of interactions, and what is it about, do you think, this topic which makes it so little understood, or even to be able to have the language to speak about it at all in general American history?
White supremacy. It's that simple. I mean, think about the way in which we define races in the United States. From the white supremacist view, it's either black and white, that's the only thing that's understood or discussed, or it's white, non-white. And the assumption is that for example, that the Indians disappeared. That somehow they were just, genocide was practiced on them, and there's no reason really to celebrate them. They were just wild. They were peoples that didn't really matter. We take them off to boarding schools, you kill them, you bury them, and forget them. And that, to me, is the history of white supremacy in this country, that it eradicates the history of other peoples that were conquered and dominated and can't be memorialized. And that's what you see, the killing of George Floyd brought all of this back to the surface again. I mean, Oñate's statue was torn down in Albuquerque, or I should say, put into covered up because of this anger, that somehow the story of Oñate killing all the residents and enslaving the residents of Acoma had not been celebrated in any positive way.
Right, and that's just speaking to the plain truth, right? It is often the erasure of what happens within people and within populations that are not necessarily, intersecting or being recorded, or even being able to speak by themselves. And what you brought up, Ramon, too, is how long, the long reach of it. 1889, just centuries long, and then how does that spin out into the present, and how would understanding what these kinds of historical relationships, what's your view on how that then impacts more about where we are now with race relations?
I'd say that that we had some very powerful senators from New Mexico that perpetuated the mythology that the people who claimed to be Españoles and were actually, had been in Mexico for a long time. They weren't actually from Spain anymore. They were essentially Creoles. And but the notion that, within the Spanish censuses, they were always listed as Españoles. So the myth of New Mexico is that, the Españoles, the Spaniards, are white. And so you get that mythology constantly being reproduced in New Mexico. And that's where the tension between the Indigenous and the Spanish really come into complete shock, because until quite recently, the Fiesta of Santa Fe, of Santa Fe's founding, was celebrated with essentially Oñate and the conquistadores coming in, lighting luminarias and remembering the fires that burned down Indian villages. And this was how it was commemorated, with the Indians as passive pawns. And for many years, the dances of the conquest were celebrated in Santa Fe and many towns in New Mexico, where again it was the history of the Spanish conquest as the Spanish wanted it remembered, and forced upon the Indians to play the humiliated and mocked and enslaved people. So it's only been recently, again, I thank George Floyd for, I shouldn't thank George Floyd, but the George Floyd moment was a moment that brought all this, percolating to the surface that had not been discussed in a long time.
Yeah,
but anyway,
exactly.
It was Senator Montoya who insisted that the quote Spanish residents of New Mexico be entered into the U.S. Census as white, and that was also a treaty provision of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that they were white citizens of the Republic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was noticing that even in the current New York Times articles, people who are Hispanic are noted as white, and just wondering how much people are carrying that designation as an artifact of the social relations that come out of the processes of enslavement and domination in the earlier time period.
No, that's a complicated question, because one of the reasons that New Mexico's statehood is so delayed is that they're desperately waiting for the population to become white enough. So on the one hand, legally, Nuevo Mexicanos are coded as white, but to the outside world, the people who are going to admit New Mexico as a state, it seems like they're Mexicanos, right? So there's multiple shades of race involved in the way people are imagining this stuff.
Yeah. So Tatiana, I was thinking about this idea of agency, expression, voicing. When you're looking into figures and people, how is it that you're able to get a sense of their own voice, considering how filtered they may be, or to understand, to really try to get a sense of who they were, or maybe how that changes over time?
Right. That's a really good question. I also wanted to just note on the question of why the uncomfortableness of talking about any slavery. I think that there's maybe like an overwhelmingness of understanding it as an economic necessity, right? Maybe putting yourself in a historical moment, which is not until like this century, where slavery is foundational, right? Slavery builds. Slavery is what grows food. I mean, it's enslaved people who are doing all of the work, and it is also very profitable, And so I think that idea, trying to put yourself into that perspective of how far-reaching slavery is in building everything in history, that makes it so that anyone new slavery is hard to imagine. Like, I think it took decades for us to kind of grapple with the immensity of the transatlantic slave trade, and now there needs to be a lot of work by scholars, by people out in the media, kind of trying to point out that there also now needs to be this other attention put into the enslavement of Indigenous people throughout the hemisphere. So in that regard, I think that there's just a lot of work to be done, and I hope that we continue to keep our students interested. I know that there's a lot of work done trying to work with high school teachers, right, to kind of input that into the curriculum. Now, for me, in terms of how you kind of articulate that past and try to explain that past, I have always found it in my writing and mainly in my teaching that it is really only if you kind of explain that through the perspective of one person, if you give that kind of the reality of slavery a face, a name, then that's how people can kind of better grapple with the reality of that person's life. When you talk about somebody having like a price in the market, when you think about that person producing from the slave owner's perspective a certain amount of capital each year, it would be measured. To think about that person having to do other work to save to be able to purchase himself or herself. If you think about it in terms of like the economic activity of that person's life, then that is kind of how I think that people are better able to understand the immensity, the economic importance of slavery and other forms of forced labor. Nobody really wants to acknowledge, right? It's kind of like today, everybody talks about capitalism being bad, but we all have bank accounts, right? So in terms of living in a world where slavery is the economy, then we kind of get too much to the point of like where I would never have been an enslaver, and then there's a lot of thinking about from that perspective, and reality is that people of all nations, people of African descent, Indigenous descent, Asian descent, people are enslavers. And so I think that that's kind of, and they're also enslaved. And so I think it's difficult to kind of grapple that out unless you talk about individuals. Processes are very complicated, but kind of individual lives are a little bit kind of, it's easier to like narrate an explanation for yourself.
Mm-hmm. So picking up on a point that you just brought up, and I'd like to put this out to the panel as well, is that when you actually use the term slavery, slavery versus bondage or indenture, how would you make that distinction? I mean, I was a student of Orlando Patterson. He was my thesis advisor. So looking at social death, right? Or as was brought up by Ramon about lack of personhood. What are the distinctions when we're talking about certainly the Spanish Empire? What's the distinction between slavery and bondage? And then, how does that term evolve over time, and how, applicable is it when we get into the US era? So I'll just throw that question out to you. Perhaps Ramon, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say Dr. Gutierrez is the specialist in.
Well, to me, the answer is the Spanish imperial law and the courts treated individuals that were purchased as property, and the only way they could cease to be property was if they could themselves raise the peculium, which was the price of their freedom, because they were given a value, obviously. And if the slave, let's say on the side, would also, grow turnips and sell, burritos on the central market of Mexico City and made an income of some sort, they could accumulate the money and petition for their freedom. The second was, if you were a slave, your owner and your master could say, upon death, I give you your freedom, and as with Tatiana's example, the house and so much money so that you can essentially become a slave owner yourself. So slavery was, again, a property relationship. The other forms of bondage were essentially they were not property relationships per se. They were obligations of tribute and labor as a result of being conquered and as a result of being entrusted to Spaniards who would Christianize and protect them. So before the law, the people that are held in bondage as a result of the encomiendas tend to be given very clear rights to emancipation, or at least their freedom from the person that is holding them by the time they're 15 to 20. But in most cases, it's usually taken as the transition from childhood to marriage. Many of them, having been brought up in these households, think of themselves as a member of the family, a subordinate member of the family. They're treated with that kind of disrespect. But nonetheless, when it's time for marriage, they tend to move out and they tend to become relatively independent. Now, the stigma of their former bondage still, resides with them. But that I think is the major difference that makes the difference. Now, I emphasized again the family and the Spanish notion of familia, because this is how these forms of bondage were hidden. Let's say you're brought into a family, they take care of you, they feed you, you work for them, you're treated as a subordinate, not really as a biological child of theirs, but nonetheless, you're in the household. And then what? You leave, and who else do you know? Who's your kinship group? So again, Orlando Patterson's notion of being kinless has a lot to do with how these individuals are incorporated into households and into notions of familia, which again, think of until recently, even in the United States, familia meant also the domination of a wife and daughters and the domination of children as subordinates who are under the rule of the patriarch. So, these are ways that these forms of labor extraction continue, although they're not formally called slavery or bondage. And instead, by the 1880s, it's called debt peonage. Now, think of that. It's that they were loaned money to take care of sheep or goats or cattle or farm this and that land, but they never were able to raise enough money to be let out of this contractual relationship of bondage, or peonage.
Right. So yes, to understand all of these layers and looking at kinship, and speaking of kinship, I think James, you're bringing up ideas of kinship, and then also where this conversation really sits between conversations, particularly in Indigenous communities, about sovereignty, right? Sovereignty enrollment, and then you have people who are lost in so many ways, really detribalized. And then, from an African American conversation, often you have the conversation surrounding, these about reparations. So, thinking, I just want to come back to you, James, about where is it looking in terms of any kinds of recovery or restoration of people who have been outside of Indigenous society or tribal, specific or originating tribal life for so long. What are you hearing on that? What are your
I think that the one case that to me is the most kind of encouraging and illuminating is the transformation in what it means to be Genízaro in northern New Mexico today. That Dr. Gutierrez is absolutely right that this was a degraded and a pejorative kind of identity for a very long time. However, since the kind of mid 60s, moving into the 70s and 80s, there has been an attempt on the part of Genízaro peoples, identified peoples, especially I've worked with the folks at BQ since the late 80s, and I think Isabel Trujillo and her family will be on this program. That we've been able to witness a transformation in the meaning of the Genízaro from this kind of slave status to a truly indigenous people. And the state of New Mexico recognized Genízaros as indigenous peoples in 2007. Formal recognition by the Senate there, so I think that there are some examples of people moving out of a one kind of a status of degradation toward one of almost a celebration. That, you know, the Carniceros of Albuquerque make the New York Times now for not for embarrassing things, but for their, you know, they have two saints' days. It's awesome. They have Santa Rosa de Lima and Santa Tomás. And when they dance, everybody turns out now. So that, you know, that's something I've witnessed over the last 20 years, and it's been great to see it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna, we've come to our time, and I think really have gone through centuries and lives and continents over this past hour and a half in a way that I think is very accessible, illuminating, truly uncovering for people to start to get this sense that what was once repressed and taken away can now be celebrated with perhaps a greater sense of agency, and also understanding the mechanism and structures of repression and enslavement and what needs to be overturned. So with that, I just want to thank you also on behalf of our audience, who I am sure has really had a mind opening, and I have to say, at more than a few instances, mind blowing sense of understanding of this very important topic, with so much more to be explored. So I would like to say thank you so much, Tatiana Sejas, James Brooks, and Ramon Gutierrez for taking this time to spend on this afternoon panel with us.
Thank you.
Pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Absolutely.